Okay. Hi. Hi. My name is Brent Bateman. I'm the State Property Rights Ombudsman. I'm very, very glad to have been invited here today. And I hope that what I have to say is helpful to you. I am an attorney. So that means that I have to spend the first 30 minutes or so giving disclaimers. I'll bunch them down this way, okay? I am not your attorney, okay? If your attorney gives you advice different from what I give you, follow your attorney. Probably even better, have your attorney call me, okay? But I am an attorney. I've been doing this for 11 years, and I work for the state government, and my job is to protect the property rights of the citizens of Utah. And one of the major ways I do that is to come to city council meetings and planning commission meetings and stuff like that and provide this training. Because the best way for us to protect the property rights of the citizens of Utah is to understand the property rights of the citizens of Utah. Having said that, having done this hundreds and hundreds of times, I have come to some conclusions, okay? Like when I first started doing this, I used to prepare this long speech, and then I decided that the speech was kind of boring, so I decided to start using PowerPoint. So I put together these PowerPoints, and I kind of got out of control with those, man. And I was putting cartoons in them and all sorts of drawings and crazy stuff and sounds, and that just really got to be awful. And then pretty soon I realized that what I was doing was I was telling you what I wanted you to hear, right? Which was not useful, okay? And so we've come full circle. And so what I do now is I come down and I just ask you what you want to talk about. Land use law. Anything related to land use law. That's all I do is land use law from dawn to dusk. I love it. I'm a land use law geek. I really enjoy my job, and I enjoy the kind of law I practice, which if you talk to most attorneys, they won't say that, because most of being an attorney kind of stinks. I use one slide, and the purpose of that slide is purely to jog your memory about things you might want to talk about. If there's anything that on that slide you want to mention, or it doesn't have to be on this slide, if there's anything you want to talk about. But most importantly, I want to talk about what you want to talk about. Okay? I want to talk about what's going on in West Haven. Okay? It just isn't going to do me any good at all to talk about, my life and what I think is going to happen, because what's happening in West Haven is going to be different from what's happening in Park City, where I was a couple of weeks ago. It's going to be different from what's happening in Kanab, where I've been. Anybody know where Aurora is? Yeah. There's a little town called Aurora in Utah. It's not far from Salina. And there's like 45 people there, and they kept me there for like 3 hours. Okay? And what is happening there is just crazy. And so, we won't need to do that at all. But the point is that if I were to tell you what I told the folks in Aurora, it'd be useless to you. Okay? So, that's why we've come to this. I'm here to talk about the law. I'm here to talk about property rights. I'm here to talk about land use law. So, what's going on in West Haven? What do you want to talk about?
I would like to talk about the role of the planning commission versus the city council and the jobs of both and where they differ.
Awesome. That's a great idea. Is there any planning commissioners here? Is the whole planning commission here? Most of you? Yeah. Thanks for coming. Appreciate that. Like, you don't leave enough Wednesday nights away from home. One of the things that often happens here is I end up preaching to the choir, because the ones that come to training and stuff like that are the ones who are conscientious and trying to do their job right. And the ones that aren't are the ones that usually don't come to training. But this is important, and that's a great place to start. It's a great question. Okay? Land use law, as with all the stuff that you do here in local government, but especially land use law, I don't know of anything that affects people more, like to their day-to-day lives, than land use law and the decisions you make in this room. Okay? I mean, what they're doing in Washington, who cares? What they're doing even in Salt Lake doesn't really affect us nearly as much as what happens here in this room. This is where the rubber hits the road. Okay? And land use law especially, because we're all property owners. We're all out here, right? And what we can and cannot do with our land is huge. It's huge, right? Whether or not I can put this or that there, whether I can do this use or that use there, it's all really critical. And it's so critical and it's so important that the legislature decided that we need two sets of eyes looking at land use laws. Okay? We need the council, right, whose job it is to make the land use laws, right? But we also need the planning commission, an entirely different group of people, right, to help and to look and consider land use issues. Okay? Now, if we want to talk about what the role of the planning commission is, the place to start is with the name, planning commission. What does that indicate? What does that name indicate? Are they called the conditional use permit commission? No. Planning commission, what does that indicate? Planning! That's right. That's their job. The planning commission's job is to plan. Okay? It's hard to understate, it's hard to overstate how important that is. How important that job is to plan. Because planning, the planning job, I'm not just talking about creating a general plan, though that's part of it. Right? But I'm also talking about ordinances and stuff like that. Okay? I'm also talking about, every single time the council adopts or considers a land use ordinance, they have to receive a recommendation from the planning commission. Every single time. They don't have to follow it. They can do what they want. But they cannot proceed until they've received a recommendation from the planning commission. That's how important the planning commission's job is. Okay? And that's their main job. Okay? Their main job is to know what people in the community want and to plan for that. To plan zones, to plan ordinances, to plan areas where that kind of thing can be implemented and to recommend that kind of stuff to the council. Okay? The council's main job is to run the town. Okay? But this land use stuff is complicated and involved, and that's why we have this great thing called the planning commission. Now, most places I know have their planning commission doing a lot of other things besides that. Conditional use permits. What does the planning commission do here? What does the planning commission do? What do you guys do?
We do that as well, conditional use permits.
Do you? What else?
With general plan, or changing ordinances, or reviewing ordinances.
Okay.
Approving zoning changes, or recommending zoning changing.
Right.
Not
Right.
approving them, but.
What would you say is the balance between the time you're spending doing legislative acts or administrative acts? What's the balance? Look, when I ask you that question, I just need to be clear, okay? Legislative acts is I'm sure all of you know because you've seen my videos. Nobody's seen my videos? You've seen, okay. Okay.
I like your video.
Okay. The legislative acts made the law, okay? Administrative acts apply the law. Legislative acts make the law, okay? The planning commission has an important legislative role. That's planning. That's recommending ordinances and stuff like that. Okay? Administrative acts apply the law. Those are conditional use permits. Those are subdivisions. Those are all those kinds of things. So what I'm asking is, what's the balance here? What keeps making that noise? Me?
I don't know.
Okay. What's the balance here, you think, in the planning commission between your roles there?
We probably do 80% of it is the administrative and 20% is the legislative.
All right. I would say that's very typical. I'll tell you that in my experience, the best run cities do the exact opposite of that. There's nothing wrong with the planning commission doing some administrative work and stuff like that. And it's very typical for the planning commission to spend all their time doing that, right? But that's not the planning commission's job. That's something that the city council said they were going to, that just sort of gave them to do, okay? But the planning commission's job is to plan and go over ordinances and decide whether or not the ordinances in the town are correct and stuff like that, and make those recommendations. That's the main thing you should be doing. You should be doing that. Having said that, city council people, okay, the planning commission need to be your friends, okay? You guys need to work together, okay? And I can't stress how important that is. I know of a lot of places where the planning commission and the city council are constantly at odds, okay? Those places, just, they have all sorts of problems. Lawsuits, things like that. You need to work together, okay? You need to have similar goals, okay? Because planning is so important. Planning is so important. Getting your ordinances right is so important. It's so critical. You know, one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to prevent lawsuits. I'm trying to keep you guys from getting sued, right? Or if you do get sued, I'm trying to keep you guys from losing a lawsuit, okay? The secret to not losing a lawsuit, I'm going to tell you the secret right now. The secret to not losing a lawsuit is having good ordinances. Having good, solid ordinances. Okay? Because you guys have to understand this. This is so important. The ordinances are the only way you have to tell people what they can and cannot do on their land. It's the only way. Okay? The fact that you're elected officials doesn't give you the right to tell people what they can and cannot do. The fact that you're elected officials gives you the right to make laws in your community. Okay? Now, making laws tells people what they can and cannot do. Okay? But short of that, in America, we don't tolerate people telling us what to do unless they're duly elected officials and they have made laws. That's what we allow. And that's why we have elections and stuff like that. Okay? Your property right, every one of you who's a property owner, your property right and the property right of every person in West Haven is this. And this is constitutional. Your property right is to do whatever you want with your land. Anything you want. So if I own a 500 square foot piece property right next to an elementary school and I want to go out there and I want to sell beer, I get to do that because it's my land and other people don't get to tell me what I can do on my land. Right? That's the rule. The exception to that rule is the ordinances that you create. Okay? The whole point of zoning is to tell people what they can and cannot do with their land. That's the whole point. You can do this here, you can't do this here, this has to look this way here and over here. And the reason why we do that is so we have a nice, ordered, beautiful community. You know, because we have to live together. If it's all just everybody doing what they want on their land, it's complete chaos. You know, the zoning comes from this case out of Ohio called the City of Euclid case, and it went up to the Supreme Court on exactly that point. Okay, the City of Euclid adopted zoning ordinances. They weren't the first, but they were the first ones who had a case go to the Supreme Court. The City of Euclid adopted these zoning ordinances, and these property owners said, "No way! You cannot tell me what I can and cannot do. You cannot put ordinances and requirements on me. I get to do anything I want." And that went to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court says, yeah, well, you know what? You're right. It's your land, and you get to do anything you want on your land. That's the rule. But we're going to allow this exception of ordinances because we want to live in an ordered community, because we have to live together. But, in order to tell people what they can and cannot do, you have to pass ordinances. Your ordinances, legally and properly enacted laws, can tell people what they can and cannot do. So, you know, your ordinances are an exception to the rule. And if you want to tell people that they can build this here, and they can build this there, and they can't build over there, you have to put it in your ordinances. Okay? And your town's changing all the time. Right? And there's areas getting built over here, and things are happening over here, and maybe we want something different over here than what we saw just in this meeting tonight. I saw several of those kind of examples of that kind of thing. Okay? You need to keep up with that. Which means that you need to be constantly working on your ordinances. Otherwise, you can't tell people what to do. The corollary to that, and if you're going to write anything down, I see some of you writing things down, and I don't know why you would bother to do that. But the corollary to that is this. If you don't put it in your ordinance, cannot tell people that they can and cannot do something. Plain as that. You are not allowed to say to somebody, you can't do this on your land, unless it says in your ordinance that. You don't have that kind of control. You don't have that kind of power. We don't allow that kind of power in the United States of America. Right? That's government run amok. Okay? So, remember that. Okay? That's why the Planning Commission should be spending all of its time, most of its time, a lot of its time at least, okay, constantly working on planning and on the general plan. And that's why the council needs to constantly be working together with the Planning Commission, okay, so that these ordinances in the town will reflect what the town wants to be, and what it wants to look like, and how it wants to feel. Okay? Now, having said that, your latitude for making ordinances is massive. It's huge. If you make ordinances, you can make ordinances about nearly anything. Okay? Some guy wants to put in, a strip club there. You don't want a strip club there. You make an ordinance that says you can't have a strip club there. There's no discussion. It's over. You have massive amounts of power. Okay? But, as I said, your power is limited to your ability to make ordinances. Right? And that power does have some limits, and we can talk about that. But that's the role of the Planning Commission. Okay? That's why the Planning Commission and the City Council have to work together, because the ordinances you create are everything. They're everything. They're so, so important. How about that for an answer?
So maybe a question on that. So if there's an ordinance that says that you, like for instance tonight, I don't know what the zoning is for that whatever that apartment complex, but if they're allowed so many per acre, and we allow them to go over that, even though the ordinance says no, how does that make us, or set us up for lawsuits from someone else?
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. You as a city are also obligated to follow your own ordinances. You do not have the ability to just ignore them. Okay? You need to understand that property rights are a three-way street. Okay? There's the landowner, right? Then there's the public, right? And then there's neighbors. Okay? All three of those people have property rights in relation to each other. When I say the public, I'm talking about the whole town. Okay? And as the city, that's who you represent. Okay? And your job is to balance the needs of the public against the needs of the landowner. Right? You want an orderly, beautiful community. The landowner may not. Right? So you make ordinances to make sure that what they do is in line with what the public wants. Right? You're creating that balance. Okay? And the neighbors are also part of that, because the neighbors voted for you, right? And the neighbors have given you input about what they want, and they have certain expectations about what's going to happen on their neighbor's land, okay? And how many times have you heard neighbors come to you and say, we want to stop what's happening on their land, okay? I get that question every day. How can we stop what that guy wants to do? That guy wants to put up a big Quonset hut. How can I stop that? I don't want a Quonset hut on his land, okay? The answer to that question always is, we have to have an ordinance to do that, okay? So how you do it is you come to the council and talk to us about creating an ordinance. If we create an ordinance that says no Quonset huts, then no Quonset huts. But no ordinance, no telling them not to do it. So there's a three-way street. So when you talk about your ordinances, okay, anytime you break one of your ordinances, you're in serious danger of violating someone's property rights. Okay? Your ordinance says 2 units per acre, right? You decide, we don't want 2 units per acre in this area, we want 1 unit per acre. Okay? Your ordinance says 2 units per acre, but you don't want that. Okay? What have you just done? You violated somebody's property rights. Because he owns land, the law says he can do something, the ordinances say he can do something, so he gets to do it. He gets to. You don't have the freedom to prevent that. But it works the other way too. 2 units per acre, you come along and say, ah, you asked for 4, we're going to go ahead and let you have 4. Okay? Well, you violated somebody's property rights. Again, the neighbors. Another reason why those ordinances are so important. Okay. Yes, sir.
What's the suggested recommendation for reviewing the general plan frequency?
Well, there isn't really one, right? Because in order to say that there is one, it would mean that all towns are the same. Okay? If you're in a small town that doesn't experience a lot of growth, that doesn't experience a lot of growth, reviewing the general plan rarely is fine. If you're experiencing a lot of growth, you need to constantly be looking at the general plan. Constantly. You know, in places in between. And every time you amend the general plan, it doesn't have to be a head-to-toe amendment. Right? You can make amendments to the general plan about one street. You know, about one little area or one little zone. You know, anytime what you feel like is best for that area changes, you can amend the general plan. And keep in mind also that although you have to have a general plan, you don't have to follow it. Okay? General plan is advisory. Right? It's to motivate you to plan. It's to motivate you to have a plan, so it's just not utter chaos. Right? But if the general plan says something and you think something else is different, something else is better, right? You can go ahead and do that, right? But wisdom, the wise community, tries to keep their general plan in pace with growth and with development and how things are going in their community. That's what they do, because that's how things get run best.
So what's your opinion of an ordinance that gives the planning commission a wide range of latitude in deciding how they're going to impose an ordinance? Or, for instance, our mixed-use ordinance gives a wide range of densities. There's discussion on whether or not it allows, there's discussion on whether or not it requires commercial and residential. There's goals and objectives in there, and so what the planning commission ends up doing is treating each individual mixed-use application as its own entity, and some of those mixed use, even though the ordinance talks to wanting commercial as a goal, it becomes solely residential. And the density of that can vary greatly. So what do you think of an ordinance that gives this planning commission that kind of latitude?
Do you mind if I read it to you?
The ordinance?
Yeah,
Sure.
is that okay?
That's fine. Always be fastest ordinance in the West.
Is that the current one?
The question is whether
Most
it's current.
certainly is.
Because
That's
there's
why I
one
had
word
to
that
grant
is
in the city
different.
council meeting.
If you will pass the mic around, it's gonna pick up a lot better on my video for the public to watch later, so I appreciate that.
That wasn't the current one. No, he gave it to me. He gave me the current one, and I changed. You the current one.
So he had the same questions that I had. And there are, on here, there's a statement of a general rule, then what your objectives are and what the requirements are. And to me, the requirements are you have to do it no matter what. Up here on the goal, it says, provide quality affordable housing units to residents in West Haven in developments that are mixed of low to high density residential uses and that may, not will, may, which means that you can or you don't have to me, include commercial properties. Areas of specific density and commercial overlays shall be determined by the planning commission. So in this, to me, I mean, the reason that we made this mixed use to begin with was to make it so that instead of R2 that had to have 2 units per acre with no potential open space or other options, this one was made so it could provide for housing, potential commercial, potentials of a variety of different things, but not necessarily required, which is down here. So in saying that, ask the question again as to your concern over it.
Well, let me just comment on it, just generally, first of all, and then we can zero in on some different things. You know, if I was, this is great, because if I was preaching religion to you, it would be like I just preached to you, and then there was an angel appear behind you. And what I mean by that is that this right here illustrates so strongly what I just said. Just, it knocks it out of the park, okay? There's nothing wrong with mixed-use areas, okay? The problem that you have is there are no standards here. There is no objectivity here. These ordinances absolutely cannot be subjective. They can't, right? So words like may, stuff like that, sentences like areas of specific density and commercial overlay shall be determined by the planning commission, those are lawsuits. Those are lawsuits that you're going to lose. And in addition to which, there are problems because they're going to cause a lot of debate and a lot of wasted time, and you know, we're going to sit in places like this and discuss it. Okay? And I want to try to really make this, paint this clearly as I can. When you're making a legislative decision, that is a decision that makes law. When you're making a legislative decision, your main concern should be, what do we want our town to look like? What do we want here? What do the people want? What do the neighbors want? What do I personally want to see? What will make our town better? Okay? When you're making a legislative decision where you're deciding what law to make, those are your considerations. Okay? When you're making an administrative decision, you're just applying the law, those are never your considerations. Making that decision based on any of those things is not only bad, but it's illegal. Okay? Your only decision to make when it's an administrative decision is, does this application comply with our ordinances? Does this application comply? If yes, the answer is yes. If no, the answer is no. Okay? So that illustrates what I just said, doesn't it? About wanting to make good, solid ordinances. Right? Wanting to take the subjectivity out, because the more solid your ordinance is, and you've got all the flexibility in the world to do that when you're making the ordinance, the more solid the ordinance is, right? The less problems you have. Somebody either comes in and does what you want them to do or doesn't. If you want commercial, you know, you have that says it may include commercial, okay? May is, under the law, considered not a mandatory word. Which means that if someone comes in with no commercial, even though you may want commercial, they come in with no commercial, that says may, they get to do it. Because, like I said to you before, they get to do whatever the ordinance says they get to do. Right? If you want commercial there, you need to say that. It needs to be spelled out here. We want commercial. We want this much commercial. When it comes to density, okay? Areas of specific density and commercial overlay shall be determined by the planning commission. Hate to do this to you, okay? But you need objectivity. You cannot just say, we like that, we don't like that. You can't do that. That's not legal with this kind of decision, okay? It's legal to say in your ordinance, because that's the legislative part, you know, what circumstances they'll get higher density, what circumstances they'll get lower density. It depends on where they are, it depends on what kind of thing they're doing, it depends on maybe they'll cluster, or maybe they'll add on some landscaping or open spaces, stuff like that. They do all those things, hey, they get higher density, right? But that's objective, right? Then they know they come and they do all those things and there's no question, right? But to just leave it to say, we'll decide when we see it. Can't do it. You can't do it. That's not legal, and it just leads to trouble. It leads to trouble. So the bottom line answer to the question is this. There's nothing wrong with this kind of thing, okay? But you're just making a problem for yourself when you make it like, just like, completely subjective like this. It shouldn't be that way.
So since this is the ordinance currently on the books,
Mhm.
and we have to follow ordinances,
Yep.
then you have to allow things that aren't identified in here specifically as not allowed. Is that my understanding?
You have to allow things specifically, I just want to
In other
follow.
words, you had said that if it's not identified in an ordinance that it can't be done, then it's allowed.
That's right.
And so therefore, if we have this kind of an ordinance that I just read to you, we all have to still act based upon that ordinance until it's changed.
Yeah, because this is your ordinance, right?
Yes, this
And
is
so you
our
still have to
ordinance.
continue to deal with the problems that it gives you.
Right, so then how do you go about proceeding until this is done?
Well, first of all, you proceed to get it done as fast as you can. Second of all, you just do what you've been doing, which is fighting about it. Amen.
So,
Yeah, a good example of
so,
that is in the general plan, there's areas of mixed use, and when they're getting discussed, it's, well, commercial really doesn't belong here, so we're not gonna require that to be placed here. Commercial
Well,
doesn't belong
that's
here,
actually
so we're
not
not gonna
completely true.
require it to be
What
placed
really is
here.
happening, to be honest with you, is that when, that's not necessarily true, George, because what happens is when a developer brings a proposal to us, we have given them the leeway to have residential or commercial or both. And so that's really what drives the conversation, is when the developer brings it to the planning commission, we review what they're proposing. We don't, and I think there's a misnomer that we decide who's gonna do what in whatever area or dictate what they're gonna do on that parcel. We don't. We're trying to fight through this ordinance and try to make sense of it in every application on every plat that we review, and that's where we're really having a big challenge.
Here's the thing, all those things that you're suggesting are perfectly doable, right? Without the danger of subjectivity, right? You're not doing that, but what you're doing and not doing, is not the problem. It's the ordinance that's the problem, okay? And so if you want to give people options, residential or commercial or both, you want to say 80% commercial, 20% residential, any of those kinds of things, you can put things in your ordinance that dictate when that happens, right? You can say under this circumstance, this will go down. And under that circumstance, that will go down, okay? Or you can even put it in your ordinance that you will give the developer the choice. You can choose how much of which to put in there. And you can say, but you have to have some of each, even. So they have to have 1% residential and the rest commercial if you want to. You can put all those things in your ordinance, and that gives you the flexibility, but it takes out the subjectivity.
So would you say based on, like, for example, we had one issue that came up a number of years ago where we had like a 1 acre parcel, and the ordinance said they had to have, we're trying to get them to have commercial and residential on the same thing, which was ridiculous, there just wasn't enough room. So could you say something in the ordinance, like any lot size under 5 acres or something like that would have to have commercial or residential?
Absolutely.
Or-
Absolutely. You
But
can
you
do
have a
that.
minimum size of the development in order for that to happen.
So that's exactly my point, Ken. So that should not have been mixed use in the general plan to begin with. And in fact, Steve Anderson pointed out when at the last planning commission pre-meeting, there were 2 or 3 areas that were mixed use, and Steve Anderson pointed out those are not appropriate for commercial. So my point is, they shouldn't have been mixed use in the first place.
Well,
If you want high
well,
density
the ordinance-
residential, zone them for high
I
density.
think you're right, George, in the point that they weren't big enough to accommodate a commercial residential portion under the mixed use guideline. So what we should have done is, the problem is the ordinance, and if we said it could be a mixed use piece if it's a 1 acre lot, we could still have it mixed use, but we need to change the ordinance where it doesn't say you have to have commercial and residential. We'd have to say anything smaller than X amount of acres would have to have one or the other. But what we're doing is exactly what he's saying. We're trying to follow the ordinance that was previously adopted and apply it to every parcel of property in the city that's designated as mixed use, and that's a huge challenge.
And we're currently, just so it'll make you happy, we are reviewing it and we're revising it.
I'm so happy!
I knew you would be, but with looking at the one that you have there right in front of you right now that she gave you, because the big problem is we have low density, medium density, moderate or high density, and then what they're talking about is then you have the variation there. And we have had some projects that have come in and said, you know, they want 11.9 on this parcel, and it's not really specified anywhere that this is low density, medium density, high density. They just come in with whatever, and then we're supposed to figure out, looking at this, which one it meets, and can we give them that much, or can we say, no, we have this range to work with, we're only gonna let you do 9.
You're gonna end up one of these days getting sued if you do that second thing.
But we recognize that we're at a risk, and we recognize that we are currently working on it. So my question is that there is a balance between someone having the right to develop their land and us sit there and work on ordinances for a while. Now, it's currently there, it has to go through the process in the meantime. You could have an owner that dies, and they need to get rid of that land, because property taxes are coming up or something, and so we just can't sit here forever. You have an ordinance, and under that situation, under this one, first of all, it doesn't say you cannot cluster, which means that, yes, it can be. Second of all, it says it may contain commercial, and may is not positive, so if they don't have commercial, then that's not a requirement either. And so, at the end of the day, we all have to make the choice until it goes through the planning commission back to us to deal with this. And my interpretation is that if they come in with those kind of things, you still have to say yes.
Right.
In essence, we have an ordinance that they can do anything they'd like to do.
Yeah, because,
Yes.
well, no,
Yes, we do.
no,
Yes, we do.
because they still have to live with that order.
But that's basically anything because it's so
But
ambiguous.
the ambiguity does create a lot of problems.
They can have houses up to, what is it, 25 units per acre with nothing. They can have a playground there to fill the whole spot. Basically, we have an ordinance that allows them to do almost anything they choose to do.
Here's the thing, you do have some options, okay? First of all, you don't necessarily have to tackle the whole thing at once, okay? You can get some real improved changes in there quick, fast, okay? Second of all, you're allowed to do moratorium without violating people's property rights.
Thank you.
Amen.
And so how do you get the moratorium in place? Because that's been a problem that we've had. So we had this problem, we identified it and said, this can't go on, this is crazy, we need to redo this. So does the planning commission recommend the moratorium? Does the mayor have to recommend the moratorium? How do we?
Moratorium is the one ordinance, the only one ordinance, that the council can pass without a planning commission recommendation.
So the planning commission doesn't have to recommend?
You can.
The council?
We tried and it failed.
I know, that's why I'm saying, how do we get it done? So that we don't have this issue ongoing, because we've got multiple ones coming out.
But you have to remember a couple things. First of all, moratorium is 6 months only,
Right.
right? You have to have whatever you have done in 6 months.
Yeah, we're working on it right now.
Second thing you have to remember is you have to have a compelling countervailing public interest for a moratorium, okay? It doesn't sound like that's really necessary in your case because of what you just said to me, and that is we're working on it right now, okay? Because there's also something called the pending ordinance doctrine in Utah, okay? What that means is that if somebody comes in with an application, okay, and you have an ordinance pending, right, which means that it's underway, making changes are underway, okay, that defeats vesting. So you are allowed to say to them, you have to wait until our new ordinance is done. So it's similar to a moratorium, but it's a little bit easier to even put on. It sounds like you guys may be already underway with that. But that's also 6 months. You have 6 months to get it done.
So how do you proceed with that? Do you say, when somebody comes into Steve for an application for mixed use, do you say, hey, we're currently working on the ordinance and we need to hold on this? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as you are officially working on the ordinance, not just, hey, we've been talking about it, we've
Now,
been thinking about it.
we started.
It's on the
meeting-
agenda,
Yeah.
been working on it, then you have a pending ordinance. And so you have 6 months to get something done, where you can tell people, you have to wait for the ordinance to get
We
done.
just had our first work meeting on that last week.
You're probably pending.
We didn't have an agenda.
It wasn't on the agenda, though.
It's not on the agenda. Is that on the
How do you have a meeting about it, have it not be on
You have
the
to.
agenda?
Well, but if you're having a work meeting, you have to announce it, that you're having a work meeting, right?
Well, yeah, but it wasn't on the agenda. It was.
You're gonna need to have it on the agenda if you want it.
Yeah, it wasn't on the agenda.
So that ordinance has some objectives, has some goals. Those things are irrelevant.
No, they're not irrelevant at all, okay? What's here is still here, okay?
I mean, is that something,
It's just you have some problems because your job, as I said, with an administrative decision, is to ask if this applies to if the application complies with the ordinance. That's your only job, okay? The problem with this is an application comes in, and any number of types of applications are going to comply with this. That's the problem, because of the subjectivity and because of the, sort of the loose way it goes. So they're not irrelevant. He still has to comply with what's here, right? But it's not, I'm sure it's not what you guys want for your town. You guys want to be able to say under what circumstances this happens and that happens, right? Remember too about property rights, okay? And this might illuminate it a little bit. People's property right is to do what the current ordinance says they get to do. So if I'm in an agricultural zone, okay, my property right is to have agriculture there, okay? I don't have a property right at that time to subdivide, because that would require a zone change, right? I have a right, but as long as what I'm doing is within what my zone says, okay, then I get to do it, and you cannot stop me, right? And anything that I want to do that fits into the ordinances for that piece of property, anything I want to do, I get to do, okay? But I don't get to do things that don't fit into that right of the property, right? Which means that that's not my zone. What I want to do is over here in this zone. My property is in this zone. Well, I don't have a right to do what's over in this zone because that's not the law that applies to my property, right? That's why zone changes are legislative. They're a policy decision. All those considerations we talked about, listening to the people, making it look like what you want it to look like. All of those are on the table for a zone change. When you make the zone change, once you've made the zone change, whatever that zone allows, that guy gets to do. Every time. Right? So you can't be fudging it. You can't be making different rules. You can't be saying, well, the zone says A, B, and C, but we want D.
So what happened here was under the same mixed-use zone, one landowner come in and developed it, it's like 6.7. The next guy come in a parcel next to him and come in and he wanted 11.7 or 11.9. Well, the guy on 6.7 said, well, we want to maintain that 6.7 right next to us, and yet you've got two areas under the same zone. One's under 7 per acre and the next one's just under 12 per acre.
And that's why you want to amend your ordinances so that that mess doesn't happen again.
And so now you got those guys with the just not quite up to 7 saying my property rights were affected because now you've doubled the density right next door to me.
That doesn't affect the first guy's property rights, okay? Unless the first guy's property rights or the second guy's property rights, either way, were approved out of compliance with the ordinance, right? If your ordinance says that that's good enough and that's good enough, and they're both good enough because it's vague and it's got problems, those guys' property rights weren't violated. The problem, what was violated was the best interest of the city.
So question back to your statement about that law, or whatever it was, that once it's in place, that we're starting to work on that development, or that,
Pending legislation.
Pending ordinance document.
is that automatic then? Is that what I'm understanding, that once it's announced, once it's on a...
Once it's pending, it's
so then,
automatic.
if that started, and a subdivision has already made the application, it lands underneath this one, and if it's come in right after that official, we are on the agenda, whatever, then they land in that category.
Yeah.
Which means that if they come in before, this is the one they land under, and then the issues that we've been having start all over for that one.
I'm not sure that it started, first of all, okay, because it hasn't been on an agenda, okay? But once it's on an agenda, it is at that point pending, which means that any application you get under that ordinance, you can say to them, you have to wait because this ordinance is pending, okay? 6 months passes and you haven't done anything, they immediately vest, okay? If you do make changes to the ordinance and now their application doesn't comply, they have to redo their application.
I guess my point is as soon as that ends up on the planning commission's agenda, everything's done, everything's set.
You don't have to do anything special.
So, how do we find out if they've already had their first work meeting? Which attorney do we talk to?
It wasn't on the agenda.
It's gotta be on the agenda.
Yeah, so we have to start it next week.
So next
We're
week.
putting it on the agenda for next Wednesday.
So I have a question on best practices, and so how do you put in that objectivity or provide for some flexibility in case someone brings a really great idea for a new project that maybe you hadn't thought about? You're not going back every 3 months and change the ordinance and say, oh, that was a good idea, or this is, are there best practices? Are there people that this is what they do for a living so they can review those ordinances because they're experts in land use and say, you know, there's these 3 other cities been doing this way, so that's the best. We would recommend that. So how do you not tie yourself down but then protect yourself at the same time?
I can tell you the answer, but you won't like it.
Change it.
You don't get to have flexibility. You don't. The best practice is to change your ordinance every 3 months. That's the best practice. You don't get to have flexibility. Like I said, when you have an administrative decision, a decision that's applying the law to the ordinance because of these rights that we're talking about, okay? Your only question is, does their application comply with the ordinance? Now, with things like conditional use permits, okay, there's maybe a measure of flexibility there as far as coming up with the conditions, right? But even those are pretty objective. They have to be related to standards in your ordinance, right? And, you know, they have to be doable conditions, right? They have to be reasonable conditions. So there's, you know, there's some creativity there, okay? And by the same token, as you're reading your own ordinances, right, you guys do have a measure of flexibility as far as what it means, a measure of flexibility as far as what it means, right? But, again, your only question is, does it comply? There is never a time when you're getting an administrative decision where you're saying, we don't want that here, ever. Or we want that different. There's never a time when you're doing that when you're doing an administrative decision. The time for flexibility is at the legislative stage. And then you have all the flexibility in the world. You almost have unlimited flexibility. The amount of power you have legislatively is massive. And that's when you get to say, we want that here, we don't want this here, we do want that here. But not at the administrative stage.
So on the one that came in tonight, you brought in the samples of the one that looks like brick that isn't, and it's not identified on our ordinance, though it does say
Our ordinance says we can pick other stuff.
consider other things, then we have 2 problems. First of all, we should take out that consider and go and relook at it, but even if somebody comes in with this new item that we've not ever seen before, it's not on the ordinance, then what do you do with it? Go and say, okay, we're gonna table it, let it pass through there, come back with another one, because it's already here. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
But then if they have a great item, that's something that we don't know about.
Okay. In order to answer that question, I have to say this to you. One thing you need to decide as a city is the level you want to micromanage. Okay? If you want a certain kind of brick, the only way you can say, we want this brick over that brick, is you have to put it in your ordinances. Right? Most places don't do that. Why? Because we can have a conversation about what kind of brick. Right? But the thing you got to remember is, at the end of that conversation, okay, what you want is not going to be the kind of brick they get to pick. Right? It's going to be the kind of brick that they want, or that they'll agree to. Okay? Again, if they come with an application and the application complies with the ordinance, they get to do it. So if they come with a brick that complies with the ordinance, or the ordinance doesn't say anything about the brick, if they come with that brick, you don't like that brick, and your ordinance doesn't say you don't like that brick, but that's what the brick that they want, that's the brick they get. They get to do what they want. Okay? If you want to micromanage to that level, and you want to say what kind of brick you want you're going to have, you get to do that, but you have to put it in your ordinance. You do not get to decide that here. But you get to discuss it. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm not trying to say that anything majorly wrong happened tonight. You get to say, what kind of bricks do you have? Oh, we would really like this. Would you be willing to do this? Sure, I'd be willing to do that. Great. Everyone wins. But if they say, no, I'm not going to do that, you don't win.
Here's the example. About 10 years ago, Hardy Plank was fairly coming in. It was sort of a new item, at least for us. We hadn't seen it. It wasn't identified on our plans as even being a potential item to use. And it's a whole lot better than painted wood and sometimes, in some people's opinion, stucco. So they come in here and they ask for hardy plank, and our ordinance says we can consider it, therefore you can consider it. In our situation, many years back, we said, okay, we'll add it to the list and have it accepted. And it was like that. Now, how do you then go through the process if somebody comes up, presents it right then, this is what we would like, we don't identify it, do they have to go through the ordinance, or can we still leave that sentence in there, may consider?
Well, the sentence itself is not a problem, as long as you remember who actually gets to decide. Okay, and that's the hard part, and that's the part that you're not going to do. You're going to consider, may consider, means that you can ask us and we'll tell you yes or no. And that is not what may consider is going to mean in that case. The only thing may consider can possibly mean is, show us what you like and we'll discuss it. But you don't get to say. They get to say, unless you put it in your ordinance.
So then how do you say no? If they come in, it's not
You
there.
don't. You don't get to
You
say
get
no.
to say great.
That's my whole point. You don't get to say no. You don't have that flexibility. However, unless you put it in your ordinance, right? And some things will happen that you are not anticipating, okay? And you'll come along and people will suggest it, and you're going to look at that and you're going to say, no way, we do not want that here, okay? And you call your planning commissions on the phone, you say, we want an ordinance right now that says you cannot do that here. No way, right? And they create an ordinance that says you can't do that here. And bam, you're good. Except for one problem. The first guy came in, and he put in the application before the ordinance changed and before the ordinance was pending. So he gets to do it. But no one else does after that. I always use the example of a hog farm. Okay? I bet you nowhere in your ordinance does it say no hog farms. So if I was to come into town and I was to apply for a hog farm, what would happen?
You would be allowed.
Yeah. It probably wouldn't really, I'll tell you why, but that's the illustration, right? The neighbors would freak out, no one would want it, they smell, they would ruin the town, right? But I applied for a hog farm, so I get a hog farm. You don't have the flexibility to tell me no unless your ordinances say that. Okay? But then you call the planning commission right away, they say, kibosh on the hog farms, and no one else ever gets a hog farm, even though I got one. No one else ever gets one. You probably disallow hog farms. Almost every place I know, their ordinances say, as far as uses go, there's permitted uses, there's conditional uses, and there's prohibited uses. If it's not listed as permitted and conditional, it is considered prohibited. Almost all ordinances say that. I'm sure that's what yours did. So I'm sure hog farms are not listed as permitted or conditional, so they're prohibited. So you can go ahead and say no to hog farm, but that just illustrates the point. Yes?
Question for you. We have an ordinance that requires that a development agreement be enacted for certain types of projects or in certain zones. And we pass those as ordinances. So where does that fall in the legislative administrative spectrum?
I saw that tonight. And, you know, what I'm about to say is probably going to cause you to run me out of town on the rail. Just don't tar feather me. Depending on how it's used, an ordinance, a law requiring development agreements is probably not legal. Probably not legal. I have to say depend on how it's used because a development agreement is just like any agreement. It's not an agreement unless it was entered into voluntarily. When you say to somebody, you have to have a development agreement, okay?
Me too, but then we negotiate on what the content is.
Well, and if you have the right kind of content, that's okay, right? But just somebody's just going to challenge it based on they said I had to do a development agreement. Thus, my development agreement should be tossed out, and you know what? A judge is gonna toss it.
So in a mixed-use zone, because that's what we currently have, a mixed-use zone is identifying on the ordinance anywhere between 1 and 20 units per acre. And in the past, we have identified it as a mixed-use zone. We'll change it to added density based upon certain allowable things like those, what makes it so you can have higher density and whatnot. Then how's the appropriate way to do that since we're redoing this mixed-use zone if the development agreement is not allowed? So that's done up front.
You put it in your ordinance. You put the conditions and the circumstances for different things in your ordinance. There's nothing wrong with development agreements still, okay? You can enter into development agreements with as many people as you want. The problem is saying you have to enter into development agreement with us. Because people, like I said, have a right to do what the zone says they have a right to do.
But our zone says mixed use, 1 to 20 zones, and very few other things.
Low, medium, and high.
Yeah, but in here, I'm just wondering if it says development agreement.
But it doesn't specify where low, medium, or high is required.
That's my point, and so putting that aside, I think Lacey's question is do we do a development agreement, and if you said that you don't have to, it puts us in hot water, then how do you make it so that it's mixed use, identified with the amount, because if it's any other zone in our city, and it's going from A1 and on the general plan it says R2, they come in, they don't present a site plan or anything. They come in and ask for it, it's on the general plan, we identify it and rezone it. In mixed use, it's a different item that we've been dealing with just recently, where it's identified as mixed use based upon a certain number of agreeable things, and that's why they put the development agreement in here, so that you are not just saying, okay, this is a mixed use zone, check it off, and then have them come in later. Do you understand what I'm saying, like in all the other ones?
I think so, but I don't know if my answer is any different than it's been, okay? You can enter into a development agreement. That's one way you can solve this. You're absolutely allowed to do that. You suggest to somebody, we do a development agreement, and we get all this stuff straightened out, and we have a great agreement, and everyone's happy. I mean, that's a great way to solve this problem.
And honestly, the reason we're having this problem is because the ambiguity of the mixed use zone. I mean, if we clarify that with proper zone.
And then you won't even need to worry about the development agreement.
We don't need it. So I got a question to follow
Well,
up.
let me finish the thought though before, and then you're next, okay? Again, just so you understand, the problem is not with having development agreements, the problem is with requiring development agreements. Because then it's not, then people will argue that this wasn't a voluntary thing for me. If you put enough consideration in the development agreement, I don't want to get into what that is, you may survive, but I gotta tell you, based on what I saw tonight, I'm concerned about this development agreement problem.
Can you require a concept development plan? Because we have an ordinance that requires.
You can require a concept plan.
Okay.
You can put in many stages as you want. You can have concept, preliminary, second preliminary, third preliminary, final.
No, so we require concepts to be attached to rezoning requests, and if that concept changes, then we have the ability to revert the zoning. That's the way our ordinance reads.
Well, first of all,
For mixed use.
No,
first of all,
there's other things too.
you always have the ability to revert the zoning.
Commercial.
You always have the ability to revert the zoning. Tying something like concept to your ability to revert the zoning is not an issue.
Okay.
You know, if you want to know what people are thinking when they come in for an application, okay, and that your zone change is conditional on that, you can consider those things for a zone change because you're allowed to for considering things for a zone change. It's humongous, okay? However, the thing you gotta understand is as soon as the zone changes, at that point, they have a right to do what the zone says they have a right to do, okay? If they come along, they change the concept plan completely and apply for something, but it still is allowed in that zone, they still get to do that. You don't get to just switch it back because of that reason. However, you can switch it back anyway, but they've still applied and they've still vested. Does all that make sense? I mean, it's kind of, everything is kind of intertwined here. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. But he was next.
I want to follow up on Curtis's question, and where he says, where's the how do you do these with and allow flexibility? And you said you don't, you put what's in the ordinance, and then you follow that. And with the planning commission, relooking at the mixed use, we desire commercial, and we stuffed in the word may at some later point in time. That word didn't used to be there. It wasn't there, so it required commercial. So we stuffed that in there because we really want mixed use, or we really want commercial in those areas that
Sure.
we've classified as, or zoned as mixed use.
Sure.
And so, you know, one of the reasons we're asking the planning commission to go back is, one, to take out the ambiguity, because it seems to me, and this is just me, that developers are coming in and someone using that saying, hey, it's mixed use, I can put anything there, so I'm gonna stuff in 20 units per acre. So if we come up, if we change the mixed use, and so we have a low density, a medium density, and a high density, and we put those, we interject those in the general plan where we had mixed use, but we really want commercial in some of these, we would like commercial in some of these also. Do we need to designate then portions of that area where we're going to change the zone from mixed use to one of these densities, and then just put in commercial and deal with it if commercial doesn't fit? How do we, I think the question that I have, and I don't know if it's the same one that Curtis had, but following up on Curtis, how do we allow mixed use to be in there, or how do we not mixed use, I'm sorry, how do we get commercial into those areas? But still have ordinances that developers can't abuse mixed use, and if they want to go in with high density, they just have to pick a high density zone. How do we, that's what I want to understand.
You said, the best way I can answer that, and it's very tempting to hair split when you're an attorney. So I'm not going to hair split some of the ways you worded that, because I think I understand your question, but the best way to answer it is to set a goal to remove as much subjectivity as you can, okay? And that means that this ordinance is going to be way longer, and it's going to have a lot more circumstances and conditions and stuff like that. You can make the mixed use, a lot of places make their mixed use zones or their, zones like this, they make them an overlay zone. Okay, so you have an underlying zone with an underlying density, right? And you make your mixed use an overlay zone. So there's two zones that apply, right? And the mixed use part brings in what you want it to bring in, right? So it brings in, the mixed use zone says you have to have commercial. If your property is in this area, you have to have this much commercial. If the underlying zone is this density, you have to have commercial in this area, this far from a road, all those kinds of things, right? Is that achievable to be 100% objective? That's going to be difficult, right? But that's what you're working towards. Because every time you take a step towards that, then your ordinance is better, and it's going to be easier to apply, and there's going to be better developments happen, and people are going to know what to come, and people are not going to come and try to pull faster on you by saying, hey, the ordinance says I can do this, so I can do it even though you don't want it. Because you've said what you want, you've been very specific.
So once the planning commission sits down and writes an ordinance, revises an ordinance, how do they know if it's going to accomplish what they want without just crying and then finding some new mistakes? Is there some resources to say, yeah, that's a good ordinance?
Is there a template?
I mean, I know everybody's probably got their city attorney, but I don't know if their own city attorney's an expert in these things to say, you wrote that, but that word's problematic before you even try to do it. Is there a revision process? I worked for the state for 30 years, and anytime we did a policy for the tech college, it had to go through it had to go to the state, because what we thought maybe we were trying to say, maybe we weren't really saying that. So you come up with an ordinance, how do you know if that's good before you just try it and see if it works?
There's three ways. There's three ways to answer that question. First of all, remember that the two bodies looking at it, there's a reason for that. Okay, they've looked at it, they've researched, they brought it up. Doesn't have to be accepted by the council. The council looks at it and says, no, it's not what we want. You can send it back, you can pass something different, right? Use the two bodies in cooperation, okay? The second way to do it is to steal. There are a lot of communities that have been through a lot of stuff, and their ordinances are up for the taking. Look at what they've done. Take it. Call them call their planners and say, what happened with this? Is this ordinance work for you? Steal liberally. And the third, but really the third is the major one, and that's what you said you wanted to avoid, but that's what you're stuck with, and that's trial and error. That's why one of the major messages, one of the major takeaways from this is to get it out of your head that your ordinances are ever finished. That's why I said right at the beginning that the Planning Commission's job, what they should be spending most of their time doing, is working on ordinances. Because these things are constantly going to have to be updated and improved. Constantly.
So is there a city out there that has got the mixed-use ordinance, and you go, hey, you seen this ordinance, and that one really works?
So, can I address that? When, we went to one of the planning, it was put on by the Ombudsman, and it was one of the meetings.
What did you call me? The Ombudsman?
Did I say it wrong?
Everyone always says it wrong. I'm just teasing.
Anyway, so we went, and there were other planning commission, I usually speak really loud, but there were other planning commission members there, and so I have their actual links to Layton and Caseville, who I think are well tried and true, and so we're going to go through those and probably cut and paste, and not reinvent the wheel, and so we're going to be reviewing all that as well. Also, I do have a question while I have the mic.
But you know what? She's been raising her hand like 4 people.
Sorry, it's quick.
Okay.
So if you said we can't have flexibility, would you have to go through and make a zone for the 3 units per acre, 4 units per acre, the 6, the 7, all separately back?
You can do it that way. You don't have to do it that way.
So what's the limit on flexibility?
As far as making the ordinances, as far as the legislative part, almost limitless.
Well, that's what we did, and you said you don't like it.
It's not that this is violating your legislative flexibility. It's impossible to administer, is the problem.
Right. So what's your recommendation on flexibility?
My recommendation on flexibility is to copy from what other people have done and just work to make sure that your ordinance says what you mean, says exactly what you
I
mean.
figure if we can fight over the difference between 6 and 8, we can fight over the difference between 6 and 7.
Okay.
So do you have a recommendation on
To
that
fight over it.
flexibility?
Yeah, that's the thing, with when it gets put in the ordinance,
But
okay,
that's back to my question. Do you write a separate ordinance for 6 and a separate ordinance for 7?
you can. But I don't have a recommendation for you. Because some places do that. Some places have a lot of different zones and several overlay zones and different things like that, and different forms of things to do. A lot of places just, in one zone, try to cover as many of their bases as they can. Okay? The thing is what you're going to want is when I say you don't have flexibility, what I mean is say some circumstances you want 6 and say some circumstances you want 7. What you don't have is when someone comes with an application and says, I want 6, and you say, no, I think you're going to have 7. That's the flexibility you don't have. What you do have is the flexibility to say in your ordinance, if you want 6, you have to do these 3 things. If you want 7, you have to do these 4 things. Right? And that way they come in, and you know exactly whether or not they get 6 or 7. And they'll know whether they get 6 or 7, and they'll get 6 or 7, and there's nothing they can do about it.
But I think the problem comes about is the city's accustomed to that flexibility, and I've seen where a guy comes in and can't quite squeeze a house in there because he doesn't have enough room to do it, and the city offers up, well, if you'll fill in that drainage ditch in consideration for the drainage ditch.
We have a separate ordinance that allows that.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. If you fill in that drainage ditch, we'll let you squeeze another house.
But you can do that in an ordinance, right?
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of places that say if you build a park, you can have a 10% density boost. Or if you cluster and leave this much open space, you can have a 50% density boost. Things like that, right? And so there's still that flexibility, right? And people can come and do all sorts of crazy things, but the point is that it's in here.
Okay, so
That it's written down.
So, yeah.
I've got a question. So that's the challenge. I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, if on the legislative piece, we have to write that into our ordinance and then it's adopted by the city council, but then you're saying we can negotiate that on the administrative end, but the conversation is we don't want to leave anything ambiguous and open-ended like that, so we're not doing that. We're just saying yes or no because you're complying with the ordinance. then how do we figure that piece of the puzzle in where the city actually could benefit from doing a little horse trading, so to speak, and give density for this or that? How do we do that in a mixed-use setting? Because if we don't have a nail, first of all, we're stuck.
Most places use very, very few development agreements. Most places only do development agreements for the very, very exceptional developments, like a multi-phase development, you know, or a development that's providing, you know, certain public amenities and stuff like that. So most places do, right? But the thing about development agreements you got to understand, okay? Just like with any agreement, what an agreement is I agree to give you something that I don't have to give you, in exchange for you agreeing to give me something that you don't have to give me. Okay? Development agreements are specifically allowed under the state code. So what that means is that if someone will willingly enter into a development agreement with you, okay, you do have room to be flexible, right? Maybe even wander away from some of the provisions in your ordinance because you can show that they gave you something in exchange, right? You have to be careful about that. And development agreements can be tricky to enforce, and they, especially long-term ones and stuff like that, so you have to be careful with that. So that's why most places are very careful and use them rarely. But as far as an agreement goes, you know, it's an agreement. And so you have way more flexibility with an agreement, as long as it's voluntarily entered into.
So we would have an ordinance with an asterisk, and the asterisk being the development agreement if both parties are interested in entering into it.
Yeah, why is there an asterisk on that?
Well, because and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but on the legislative piece, what I hear you saying is we need to make sure we work out all that. That's where our huge amount of flexibility is. We nail it all down, we get it all in writing, we adopt it, and then as soon as it goes to the enforcement piece, or the, you know, when we're trying to do our job to approve these things, there's no wiggle room. It's all been decided during the legislative process. So if we enter into a development agreement, that would be the asterisk, allowing us to say to that other party, okay,
the state law already says you get to enter into development agreements. And development agreements are a question of give and take, right? So that means you have to give them something that they don't have to already, they have to give you something they don't already have to do, which already by itself wanders away from this, as long as it's voluntary. So I'm not saying that you cannot use a development agreement to have some flexibility. That's the exact opposite of what I'm saying. The development agreement will give you some flexibility.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying that on the legislative piece, when we nail down the ordinance, what you had said earlier, at least what I understood you said, is we want to have all that ambiguity nailed down by the time we adopt the ordinance, so there's really no discussion when it comes to the administrative portion of it.
Right.
So we say, you met the ordinance or you didn't meet the ordinance.
Right.
So when do we allow that flexibility to come in on the administrative side? Because that's what it sounds like. We have to do that as a city, or there's not mutual benefit for allowing more density or amenities because we, you know, this.
The way I answer that question is to remind you that people have a right to do what the ordinance says they have a right to do. Right. Which means that if they come in with an application that complies with the ordinance, that's what they get to do. And you don't get to say, no, you have to do a development agreement or do something different. But if they come to you willing, if they come to you saying, I want to do a development agreement, right? Then you enter the development agreement and you have all the flexibility in the world, despite what your ordinance is saying. That's what I'm saying. And so the point is we can't agree on a development agreement. We can't agree, we can't settle that. Well, then we're back to what the ordinance is saying and complying with that.
So when you got a piece of property where somebody thinks that, okay, you get some give and take, and you do a development agreement, you get some more density, then you've got another piece that this guy thinks it's the same piece, but in our eyes it might be a little bit different. And he argues you gave those guys a development agreement, how can you give me one?
There is no precedent. You do not set a precedent by approving or disproving or giving one person benefits, another person benefits. Just because you do something for one person, you don't have to do it for everybody else.
That actually was the best reason why I was here.
You have to follow the ordinance, they have to follow the ordinance, okay? I hear all the time where people come to me and they say, I can walk down my street and I can show you 6 garages on my street that face the front, that face the road, okay? They have an ordinance that says your garage has to face the side. 6 garages on my street face the road, now they're telling me my garage has to face the side. Everyone else, they let them face the road. What does the ordinance say? Garage has to face the side. So what do you have to do? Your garage has to face the side, right? Just because the city violated the law 6 times doesn't obligate them to violate the law 7th time. You just don't set a precedent. Each piece of property is different, each property's needs are different, and each development's needs are different. Yeah.
So if you're recommending that development agreements are used in rare cases, what's a better vehicle for dealing with situations? A lot of times we'll have developers say, hey, I'd like to build this amenity, and then turn it over to you. So that's an issue that we typically deal with in a development agreement is, okay, what does build it mean for us to be willing to take it? And at what point in the process do we take it? So is there a better way to deal with that outside of that?
That's one of the things that your ordinances can handle in the vast majority of cases, because you're going to have a minimum building standard for something like a road.
Well, we don't do it for roads, we usually do it for, we've had a couple developments recently want to build a public park.
Okay.
And turn it over. And we don't want it if it doesn't have grass in it, for instance, or other circumstances, where we don't want to take it unless these conditions have been met, and they don't want to keep it if the conditions have been met.
That is a circumstance where a development agreement is good.
Okay.
That's a circumstance where a development agreement is good, understanding that if they don't want to do the development agreement, it defaults back to what the ordinance says.
Okay.
I would just like to understand the relationship between planning commission and council. If planning commission gives approval for a development under certain parameters, and then it comes to council, and they say, no, we don't like what they said, we're going to change it. What parameters does the council have to use what the planning commission has approved and sent forward?
When the planning commission when their job is to make a recommendation to the council is under zero obligation to follow the recommendation. Zero legal obligation, okay? The hope is that the planning commission will understand that the council will understand that the planning commission worked hard on this, they considered it, they talked about it, right? And so they will take the planning commission's recommendation seriously. But there's no legal obligation to follow the planning commission's recommendations.
I still have the microphone and Lacey.
I know, I'm sorry about that.
So my question has to do between the planning commission, city council, and developers. Is it ever appropriate for a planning commissioner or a city council member to meet with a developer prior to a hearing?
Sure. Sure, there's no reason why you can't do that. Now, you can't have a quorum go do that, because if a quorum's doing that, then you have a public meeting, right? But yeah, I mean, you can meet, you can email, you can text, especially if you're working on a legislative action. Okay, if you're working on a legislative action, you should take all the input you want, all the input in the world that you can get, because of that, the level of legislative flexibility and so forth. Working on legislative action, man, I mean, you want to find out as much information from people as you can. When it comes to administrative action, you're trying to find facts, right? And so having a discussion about facts is fine. Just don't violate the Open Public Meetings Act. You can do that, no problem.
One more time. On HOAs, can the city require or say to a developer, we'll approve this if you put in an HOA or you have a functioning HOA to take care of us? Can that be a requirement?
Yeah, I mean, again, if it's in the ordinance or in the development agreement, stuff like that, yeah, you can do that. I wouldn't recommend it. I know places that do that, and it has become a huge problem. I can tell you a couple places right now that they don't want to accept any more roads, okay? Because they just don't have a road budget, and they don't want to go out there and have to maintain and plow and stuff roads. And so what they're saying to people is every time you develop, all your roads are private, and you have to form an HOA to do that. And they've been doing it for a few years, and it's really starting to bite them back. Because most HOAs fizzle out. Most HOAs, you get the first group of neighbors in there, and they're very uptight and wound up, and so the president of the HOA ends up being a huge pain in the neck because it's the most wound up person in the whole neighborhood, because that's why they ran for president. But 3 presidents later, the president of the HOA is like some move-in who wasn't there originally, and is not doing anything, and then that guy moves and they don't even have a meeting or an election, which leaves you with an unmaintained road in the city and a whole lot of phone calls.
On several of these HOAs, though, they are putting the house down and allowing open space around them. There's, anyway, they want it that way so that they, one of them, for example, is like, that came in years ago, was like they had a large area, they had people that wanted just to go out and do whatever they wanted to do and not have the yard obligation to be able to have the open space. So
Yeah.
basically, they're making a park, for lack of any better.
Yeah, the lawn is a common area, basically.
Yes. So then how is your better way to deal with that than the HOA?
There isn't. There isn't a better way to deal with that. The HOA is the way to deal with that. I didn't say that it's, I said it was a pain. I didn't say it was illegal or impossible. I mean, there's no better way. The people, that's the people's common area. They own it. They should be responsible for taking care of it. Does that mean the city's not going to get phone calls? They're going to get phone calls.
Private company, build and do all that.
Yeah.
Individuals.
Yeah, and hopefully they keep doing that for a long period of time, hopefully. And what happens if they don't? And you make some calls and you're out there and there's a bunch of weeds now. And, no one will take responsibility for it, it's just a pain.
So if they want to come in on HOA, can the city say no?
Well, if your ordinance says that you can say no.
We have, I think, a lot of discussions on mixed use. It's a very new concept in our city. And we're having some growing pains on how that exactly works. And as obvious you can see in front of you, very broad, very general. And I like what you said about it's a partnership on the property use. It's the council, it's the citizens, it's the property owners next door. We have a few instances on a clustering, which, I mean, in theory, if a property owner had 100 acres of land, and you want to donate 90 acres to the city, you build on 10 acres and take all that average.
You're about to smack somebody in the face.
Oh, and dump all that property on a few acres. Now, it meets the criteria that's in there, but it's not what the citizens want, and it's certainly not what the property owners want. And there needs to be some way of addressing those kinds of issues. It's an anomaly, but most of the time it's a development that has an acre or so that has a park or a detention pond or something in there. There are those situations that come up that make it unusual, and those need to be addressed by ordinance, and so that they know what's going on and what to expect. So when a developer comes in with a lot of money and wants to put this in here, it just says, here you go. That's the deal. And that's what it is. And so I like the process of the ordinances. I think that's really important. I think it's again, it's a three-way partnership here. And sometimes that gets overlooked.
A lot of times places regret inviting me. Because I tell them, all these things and they leave just, I leave and they're just like, oh, there's so much. And again, I urge you to not think that way. I urge you to think, just work to improve constantly. Just work to improve, make a one-sentence improvement that will address the biggest problem. And then start working on the next improvement and the next improvement, right? And constantly be working to improve all this stuff. The thing about the partnership is when you want to get the most input is at the legislative stage. And that's not when the people show up to the meeting. Right? When you're doing a zone change or when you're doing an ordinance amendment, people don't show up. It's when somebody comes with an application for the hog farm that people show up. Okay? I want you to think about this whole concept that we've been talking about in terms of your protection. Okay? the protection of the city and of you, okay? And what I mean by that is, if your ordinances are solid and specific, and someone comes with an unpopular application, okay, at that point, okay, you can just say to them, this is what our ordinance says, okay? And when you said that, you don't have to listen to them, you don't have to fight with them, you don't have to fight amongst themselves, and you know you'll win when you get sued. You know you'll win, okay? When you're taking it, a more subjective approach, when someone comes in with an application, and there's, you know, you guys have to make some decision, you know, or just decide subjectively, or the language is vague, okay? And the people come, right, and decide, okay? People come and they yell and scream. In that case, you know you're going to get sued. Because if some neighbor doesn't sue you, the developer is going to sue you, depending on what you decide. One or the other is going to sue you. And that's the lawsuit you're probably going to lose. Right? So this, what I'm talking about, this trying to improve this and make it as objective as possible, is really just to make your life better, and to make the city run better, and to make, you know, Ken happy, and to protect you all. Because we do have plenty of cases, I can show you, where cities and counties have been sued and lost multi-million-dollar verdicts because the government didn't follow their ordinances.
We have great community support, which is great. And I was just wondering, what advice would you have to citizens that are involved? We have some great citizens, and to give them more kind of, what's the word? Any resources or links that they could go to so that they do like a public hearing, how they can be heard. And, you know, a lot of times we hear the same things over and over, and the schools are overcrowded. And I think some of them are learning, there's a learning curve that, okay, we can't use that, you know, as far as our decisions. What would you advise some of the citizens to get more educated? And because we have some great citizens that have a desire to learn more and get more involved, but they just aren't understand. They think that their emotion can, and it gets very emotional in our meetings, and they just don't understand. And actually, some emails that we get are a little bit, some of them are a little intense, and I'm just, you know, I think they're just expressing themselves, but it's kind of crossing the line sometimes.
This government work is great, isn't it? I mean, how do you even go to the grocery store? Yes, I do have several pieces of advice along those lines. First of all, do what you can to get the citizens there doing the legislative parts. Because then they can say what they want, and you can listen to what they want, and you can implement it all you want. All right? That's when they get to say, how to say it. Is that easy? No. Is it likely to succeed all the time? No, but do what you can to get in there. The second thing is, during the administrative parts, try to help people understand the difference between clamor and evidence. Right? And it's not easy to understand. I mean, I'm sure that most of us in the room are not really clear what the difference is. Right? But you illustrated it to a large extent. Evidence is facts, objective facts, okay? Relevant facts. You're allowed to consider those when you're making an administrative decision. Clamor is based on emotion. It's based on slippery slope. If you say yes to this, children will die. You ever heard that? If you say yes to this, my property values will go down, right? This is just, this is not why I elected you. You know, if you do this, you're going to go burn, burn, burn. I've heard people say that to their city officials. You know, you're probably going to burn. That's clamoring. You're not allowed to make the decision based on that, an administrative decision based on that, right? And so you help people understand. So one thing you can do at the beginning of a public hearing, especially controversial ones, is you can say to people, understand, right, what we can and cannot consider. If you have facts that you can back up with evidence, okay, that will be helpful. If you're just here to voice your opinion, that is not helpful, because that's clamor, and we can't consider that. And the third piece of advice I would give to the citizens is to, well, it's related to the second one, but it's to do your homework. You know, they don't, administrative decision is not a majority rule situation. The more people you get there, it doesn't make any difference, okay? One person there, though, with good